I thought you were actually going to be getting the chief exec, you were going to be getting Darren Mockery, but he was told he had to go and speak to one of the HOSCs. So in the pecking order, going and speaking to a HOSC clearly is more important than coming to speak to you. So I've come to speak to you instead. But I thought if he were talking to you, he'd probably talk to you about SECAMB, because I think ambulance services, rightly or wrongly, feel that they are generally misunderstood. They are very busy and very high profile when it comes to what goes on TV and what people think is really sexy, like driving on the wrong side of the road on blue lights in a big yellow truck, and that's absolutely true. But in terms of health planning and working out how a health system is going to operate, ambulance services tend to get forgotten. So I thought I'd come and talk to you about SECAMB. And I guess my objective is to see whether I can tell my colleagues who know SECAMB probably much better than I do, because I've only been here for 9 months, something they didn't know. So here we go. We became a foundation trust in 2011. To become a foundation trust, you have to jump through lots of hoops to prove that you are financially stable and sound and you deliver a high quality service. So certainly in 2011 we did manage to jump through those hoops, and I guess things have rather gone downhill since. And if you look at CQC reports, you will find them littered with foundation trusts which have gone in the wrong direction, and that's possibly because to gain foundation trust status they've had to make such swinging financial savings that their clinical care has and their structure has suffered. So one of the problems that SECAMB has is that it's a big trust. It covers 3 counties and a little bit of Hampshire. It became SECAMB in 2006, but actually it has essentially remained 3 ambulance services, and it has not really come together as SECAMB. So people still talk about, well, when I worked for Sussex Ambulance Service, or when I worked for Surrey, or when I was in the control room at Sussex, it wasn't like this. So one of our major challenges is to build SECAMB, to build it as a unit. So we serve a population of 5 million. For me, that's not very much, because London serves a population of about 9 million, most of whom live outside London and come in during the day. And we cover an area of 3,500 square miles. So that's a massive patch. And it's a very diverse patch. So there are areas of extreme wealth, mostly in Guildford and in the Waverley area, and of extreme poverty. Perhaps not always cheek by jowl in the way that you get in some of the big cities, but if you look at some of the environments down in Kent, particularly in the Medway towns and in Thanet, there is awful poverty and deprivation. One of the challenges of working in the South East Coast is that there are more MPs per square mile than anywhere else in the country, and of course that includes the Secretary of State for health and now health and social care. I don't think there are too many problems about social care in his particular patch, but it does focus the minds of the government if they are actually getting letters from their constituents talking about their local ambulance service. So we are fairly high profile. And we respond, of course, as you know, to 999 calls to the public and other healthcare professionals. And we provide 111 for most of the patch in combination with Care UK. Now that's important because historically the Trust has been really keen to be seen as not just an emergency service but an urgent care provider. And if you are providing urgent and emergency care, it makes a lot of sense to run 111 alongside the 999 service. So that makes a lot of sense. The problem is that the triage system used in 111 is known as NHS Pathways. And currently, it used to be 5 ambulance services used NHS Pathways, of which SECAMB is one, and 5 use the alternative registered system, which is known as MPDS, or Medical Priority Dispatch System, which is a much more from my point of view, it's a much more rigorous system, which is much more algorithm-based and depends much less on the judgment of the individual call taker. With Pathways, the calls take considerably longer. The advantage is you can take a call right from when the call comes in to final disposition, so please go and see your GP in 4 hours. whereas MPDS doesn't do that. But the systems are quite different. So the theory that we run a service that encompasses both urgent and emergency care works fairly well. The practical elements of the triage system that we use in the 999 system is perhaps less well suited to an emergency service, particularly at times of high demand, because you can't flex your staff in the same way. Pathways has got some very strict rules. So if you are a call handler, you have to take a certain number of calls a month. So dispatchers, the people who actually send the ambulances out, they can't take calls because they don't have the time to do the requisite number of calls a month. Does that make sense? Right, and I guess critically, we are the only NHS trust covering the whole region. That's SECAMB, shown in a not particularly attractive diagram. There's an awful lot of sea down here, so we don't actually get involved with the fish, fortunately. But we do have 22 clinical commissioning groups, or CCGs. They're the people who are supposed to fund us. They're not supposed to fund us, they do fund us. And there's a continuous battle to see if we can get enough money from them to provide a safe and sustainable service to the public with a level of quality that you would expect of a modern day ambulance service. We have 12 acute hospital trusts, and you can see them scattered across the region here. If you wonder what the number 5 is, those are the mental health and community trusts. It took me a while to work that out. There are 4 specialist and mental health trusts. We, of course, work, I think, increasingly closely with KSS Air Ambulance Trust, who now offer a 24/7 service across the whole of the patch, and do have the capability of operating by road as well as by air. That's important because as we look at some of the more remote areas of the patch and some of the particular challenges that we have in providing specialist care, if you think, for example, of a patient who has a large vessel occlusion in a stroke in this neck of the woods, it's going to take a very, very long time to get them by road to anywhere that can fish the clot out, a technique known as thrombectomy. And essentially doing that by air is probably about the only solution. We work closely with our blue light partners. We have 3 police services and 4 fire and rescue services. So it's really unfortunate that there's not more coterminosity with the other emergency services, because, for example, examples of good practice that we set up in London was getting the fire brigade to co-respond with us. Now, actually, that's all gone a bit bent because the FBU have withdrawn that at the moment, but we did have the fire brigade co-responding on certain life-threatening calls, in other words, going to cardiac arrests. And that's great, because if you have 5 or 6 firemen turning up, they can do really good CPR. But in addition to that, they are very good at extricating patients and organising extrication. So they will get your patient from wherever they are in the house out to your ambulance really very expeditiously. We also managed to persuade the Metropolitan Police to put defibrillators on all their response cars in every borough in London. The then Commissioner, Sir Bernard Hogan-Howe, I thought very cheekily wrote to the Secretary of State and said, "Will you fund it?" And to my amazement, he wrote back and said, "We'll go halves with you." But in the last couple of weeks, they have defibrillated 2 patients who have survived to hospital discharge. One was a guy in his 50s, the other was a 6-year-old child who electrocuted himself in the bath. And the police defibrillated him, and he was discharged from hospital 2 weeks later. So working closely with the other emergency services is actually really important, particularly if you've got long running times and you need to get boots on the ground. So we have 3 major trauma centres on the patch. Well, actually, maybe not on the patch. We've got the one that's just across the road here. And then, of course, we've got St George's and we've got King's. So, again, that's great, but it does mean there are quite long running times. There are a number of centres that accept patients for PCI. They're shown in green. So here, that's Frimley, Ashford St Peters, and then there's Ashford down in Kent, there's Maidstone and Tunbridge Wells, and the Royal Royal Sussex down here. Stroke services are being reconfigured at the moment, so Surrey is getting its act together and have stroke services at both Frimley and Ashford and St Peters. They're about to, they're trying to designate a third stroke centre, but there's a certain amount of debate, which is a good way of saying argy-bargy, going on, because, afternoon Julian, the East Surrey, evening. East Surrey will at some stage become a stroke centre, but they're a little reluctant to do so until there are border issues sorted out with Princess Royal down here, because
border police.
They want some border police in here, because there is an allegation that too much stuff from down here goes up there, and therefore leads to capacity issues. My concern is, and this is always the case with reconfigurations, what are the unintended consequences? So if you close the stroke centre at Epsom, what is the knock-on effect? Are our crews going to go from here to Redhill, or out here, or are they going to think, well, I know where there's a really good HAZU that's got thrombectomy services, and straight up the A217 to St George's? Bit of a debate going on at the moment around patients from the whole of this area and where they're going to go for thrombectomy, because St George's are putting up the shutters a little bit at the moment, which is perhaps not great for patients. I think there's a lot of work going on around vascular services, and of course there is the Queen Victoria Hospital, which remains the only burns and plastic centre in this region. Again, that's a concern because the Queen Vic doesn't have an A&E department and is limited in its critical care facilities. So, we've been doing quite a bit of work recently in terms of sorting out our estate. So we have more than 100 ambulance stations scattered across the patch. And the estate strategy for SECAMB was to go to make-ready centres. So if any of you have seen our make-ready centres, they're stocking-grey hangar-type places that have excellent facilities for staff and pretty good facilities for vehicles. So you drive your vehicle in, it gets cleaned internally as well as externally, and it gets sorted out by a make-ready team who make sure that the crew, when they come on, have a freshly prepared vehicle that's got all the kit on it that they require, and all they need to do is to bring their drug bags and their radio and their keys onto the vehicle. So we've got our headquarters at Crawley. We've recently relocated from Banstead, which I have to say was the worst working environment I have ever seen in my career. We're still using that as our training centre, and we've also closed down one of our control centres in Lewes. So we are essentially modernising the way in which we work. I'll come back to that a bit later. So currently we've got 2 EOCs, one at Crawley and one at Coxheath. We've got the 111 centres at both at Ashford and Dorking. The plan was to have, I think it's 15 make-ready centres, so we're just over halfway there, but still work in progress, and still a lot of our estate is very old and not necessarily fit for purpose, which means that it's difficult to get the ambulances serviced adequately, to keep them clean, to have proper facilities for managing medicines and managing equipment and consumables. And then we have 2 HART bases, hazardous area response teams, and I'll come on to a little bit more detail about those in a minute. We've got over 3,500 staff, the vast majority of whom are patient-facing in one way or another, whether it's out on the road dealing with patients or it's in the control room. We have specialist paramedics. We've got paramedics both at Band 5, they are now newly qualified paramedics, and at Band 6, that's a recent development in ambulance services. And I think recognises the fact that paramedics are essentially autonomous practitioners who go out and see patients in their own homes and make the sorts of decisions that nurses in an A&E department, and indeed doctors in an A&E department, would not make without access to diagnostics, to records, and to a senior opinion. We have ambulance technicians, we have emergency care support workers, or ECSWs, and I discovered that we've still got 6 ambulance care assistants. I don't know where they've been, but... And of our staff, 52% are registered healthcare professionals. That's important because it impacts on the way that our practitioners can use medicines, particularly prescription-only medicines. And SECAMB's got a bit of a history in that regard of letting people use things because it sounded like an awfully good idea at the time, and it was probably to the benefit of patients. The trouble is it might not have been legal. And then you have the CQC come in and they tell you it's not legal and you look a bit of an idiot, particularly if you're the accountable officer for controlled drugs. So we've got our specialist paramedics are either CCPs, of whom we have 57 whole-time equivalents, which is probably more specialist paramedics than any other ambulance service in the country. And we have I think it's about 52, but watch this space because it changes on a daily basis. Paramedic practitioners. This was a really innovative development within SECAMB, and 5 years ago, SECAMB was the go-to trust in certainly the south of England because its development programme for its staff was way, way better than anything else available in any other ambulance service. Our problem is we trained 320 paramedic practitioners and we've got about 50 left, and the rest of them have all gone off and worked in your A&E department and your A&E department and in GP surgeries. And the reason for that is not just that they got paid at a band 7 or a band 8 or that they didn't have to work in nasty cold conditions or they weren't working during the night, but probably primarily because we weren't tasking them to the sorts of jobs that they'd been trained to do when they did their paramedic practitioner course. And that's a really good learning point, because if you give people additional skills and training and then you use them like just to answer red 1s and red 2s, they'll get awfully fed up and they'll leave. We've got 84 staff in our heart teams. We've got around about, well, it's more like 350 staff in our EOCs, but if you add in paramedics and nurses, it's approaching 400. And the whole ethos about our EOCs is to increase the amount of hear and treat that we do, because a lot of patients who ring 999 or 111 do not need a 150k worth of blue light ambulance coming to their front door. You can manage them and direct them to a more appropriate place of care over the phone, but you generally need experienced clinicians using software support tools to do that safely. And amazingly, we've got 650 CFRs, which is an incredible resource that we don't use as well as we might. And I've just been having an interesting debate about what should we be using them for. Should we be sending them to, for example, paediatric cardiac arrests? So what do we train them in? Well, we train them in basic life support for adults and children, and then we don't send them to paediatric cardiac arrests, which is a bit odd, particularly if you think they're community first responders, so they live in a village and they like to look after that village. So Joe down the road, his baby has a cardiac arrest, and we don't send the guy who lives 500 yards up the road. We send an ambulance from 10 miles away. So how does our community first responder react to Joe and his friends when they say, my baby had a cardiac arrest and you didn't come, and you could have done life-saving treatment? And yet, should we be sending CFRs to some of the most stressful cases that anybody can manage? Discuss. Okay, oh, and we've got 36 chaplains, which is amazing. And they are really valued by staff, and they go and they see staff on our bases and they talk to them, and they're an important way of de-stressing. I find this amazing because in London we had one. He was called the Rev Trev and we never saw him. So CCPs have got additional training in resuscitation, advanced airway skills, and management of really unwell patients. They also have additional drugs. They are currently the only paramedics in the country working in a statutory ambulance service as opposed to an air ambulance service who are authorised to use a paralysing agent, and they do so with the authority of some of the gentlemen in the room here. They also use midazolam, tenecteplase, magnesium sulfate, calcium chloride and phenytoin. They are probably going to lose the phenytoin fairly shortly because there are probably safer alternatives for second-line anticonvulsant therapy. The paramedic practitioners I've already mentioned, they are targeted to more complex cases, and for that read patients with lots of comorbidities. They may not be all that sick, but they need more specialists, and they need people who have done a lot more training in diagnosing illnesses which can potentially be treated in the community and referred within primary care. They carry additional drugs as well. They are mostly additional analgesia and antibiotics. And they have a higher non-conveyance rate, and that's in a trust which has got the highest non-conveyance rate in the country. So, heart. So, heart is a very sexy bunch of people, okay? They do lots of really interesting things. They work at height, they work in water rescue, they work in confined spaces, and they work in CPR and wearing funny suits. It's a nationally commissioned resource, which means that people can come and inspect you on a regular basis and tell you what you're not doing to the right specification. We have two teams which are strategically located. One is at Gatwick, therefore close to the airport. One is at Ashford, therefore close to the Channel Tunnel. These are reckoned to be high-risk sites. One of the requirements is that a team of 6 is ready to deploy within 15 minutes. We don't actually meet that standard all the time, but we should, and we will be shortly. And there are exacting standards about training, the numbers, and to have 2 teams of 6 available to move at 15 minutes means that if you have short-term sickness, you have a major problem. So actually 84 is probably not enough. They also are our MTFA, marauding terrorist capability. You may not think that South East Coast is at risk of marauding terrorists, but if I were a marauding terrorist, I would regard Brighton as being a very attractive site. So, the only thing that we really get hammered on is performance. That's really what the people who pay us for our activities and the people who inspect us are very interested in, our 999 performance. And that's not completely crazy, because if your performance is about getting to the really sick people quickly, then performance is important. But it drives odd behaviours. And the performance targets that we were working to were the ones that I've illustrated here. So essentially, RED 1 and RED 2, we had to get 75% of those patients in 8 minutes. RED 1 patients are essentially patients in cardiac arrest or peri-arrest, and RED 2 are all the rest of the sick patients. But the triage systems that ambulance services use mean that 50% or thereabouts of the incoming call demand is a RED 1 or a RED 2. RED 1, probably about 2%, the rest are RED 2. So you have ambulances screaming round the patch to 50% of the incoming 999 calls, and that cannot be right. And essentially, they were going to a lot of calls which did not need a response that quickly. So, 3 years ago, the ambulance response programme was designed and trialled in 3 ambulance services: South West Ambulance Service, West Midlands and Yorkshire. And they amassed a great deal of detail and figures on that, and they reckoned that it was a safe way to go, and so that was brought in March this year, and sequentially each ambulance service went live on ARP, Ambulance Response Programme. Just a little bit of context about where we were. We get about 1,999,000 calls a year. We've seen demand go up 5% a year. That is the same as every other ambulance service in the country. And our conveyance rate is around about 55%. Now, the national average is between 70 and 75%. So we have a relatively low non-conveyance rate. That is really good for the health economy, because it means that more patients are managed in primary care and fewer patients are taken to the emergency department. But it is a potential risk, because I would suggest that many of those patients have those decisions made in the absence of any diagnostics, in the absence of the sort of information you might need to make that safe decision, and in the absence of the ability to phone a friend and discuss whether you're doing the right thing. So it is risky. The other really important metric in ambulance services is how quickly you pick up the phone. And the standard is to pick it up within 5 seconds, 95% of the time, and that is 2 rings. You can imagine how frustrating it is to have the 999 call not answered, because you're not even in the system. And for me, this is probably the most important metric, because unless we know what demand is out there, we don't know what we can do to manage it. And essentially, we failed dramatically on all our response targets. So where are we now? We went live in SECAMB on the 22nd of November. For us, it wasn't great timing, because in June and July, we brought in our new computer-aided dispatch system, which meant that we had to train our control rooms in using a new CAD. And that's actually quite time-consuming. And as soon as they finished that, we then had to train them in ARP. And that meant that our call handling was appalling. So in the months between May and December, our call handling has been in 40 to 50%. And what that means is that we have a number of patients who have been on the phone waiting for it to be picked up for in excess of 5, sometimes 10, occasionally 15 minutes. And that is not where you want to be as an ambulance service. It has actually recently got a lot better. So ARP now has 4 categories of calls. Cat 1, which of course is confusing because everybody thinks of Red 1. So the Cat 1 is about 6%. So this is all the previous Red 1 calls plus some of the more acute Red 2 calls. So these are the really sick people, about 6% of the demand. Then there's the Category 2, which is currently about 53% of our demand. So these are the people who need a response pretty quickly. The response time for Cat 1 is a mean response of 7 minutes and a 90% of 17 minutes. And Cat 2 is a mean time of 17 minutes. And then there are the Category 3 and 4, which are the less seriously ill and injured, particularly Cat 4, which is about 2% of the calls. Cat 3 is about 40% of the calls, and that is the mean time there is 120 minutes or 2 hours. So there's a big difference between being a Cat 2 and getting a transporting response, i.e. a double-manned ambulance, in 17 minutes, and being a Cat 3 and getting a response in 2 hours. And that's the big challenge that we have had over the last 6 weeks, because we've performed really well on Cat 1 and really pretty well on Cat 2. So having been the worst performing ambulance service in the country, we are now middle of the pack. In fact, we were 2nd and 3rd for a couple of weeks in Cat 2. But our response to Cat 3 has not been that great. Now, if you think the people who fall into Cat 3 are granny on the floor, uninjured, that's not, it's possibly a safe service, but it's not a high quality service. And if we leave her on the floor for a very long time, then it's certainly not a safe service either. So where are we? This is, I think it's the week, that's the week commencing the 6th of January. These are all the ambulance services in the country. The gap there is the Isle of Wight, who haven't gone live yet. They've only got 4 vehicles, so it's not going to make a big impact. And what you see here is the Category 1, 2, 3 and 4. And that's SECAMB there. And that's the 7 minutes and that's the 15 minutes. So actually, for Cat 1, we're doing not too badly. We're not hitting the target, but we're getting in within that one. And with Cat 2, we're actually doing pretty well. Cat 3, we're not doing so well, but we're not in anything like the same sticky position that North East Ambulance Service is. And I don't know if anybody's seen some of the recent publicity about East of England, who are having an absolute hammering from the press and their local MP. And it'll be the Cat 3s and the Cat 4s that are dumping them in that position. So we are getting better at knowing where we are data-wise. So in terms of having robust business intelligence, we have struggled. But so this is what we get every day to follow performance, and this is last week. So green is good and red is not so good. So the important bits here are the Category 1 mean. So that's that figure there. So that's the number of calls a day. So total number of calls each of those days, or total number of incidents, is shown along there. And we knocked along at just over 7-8 minutes. That was a bad day, 11 minutes. But the other 90% centile, these are all green. And interestingly, remember I mentioned call handling performance? We had one day when we were above the national target. That's the first time since I joined SECAMB. That's fantastic. But even here, we're in the 80s and 70s, so it's not the 30s and 40s, which from a patient safety point of view is absolutely critical. Right, clinical performance, because getting there quick is important. What most clinicians want to know is what sort of a service do you provide to the patient when you get there. So our performance historically has been measured in two ways: the so-called ambulance clinical quality indicators, or ACQIs, when we look at outcome from cardiac arrest, both in terms of ROSC and in terms of survival to discharge. We look at outcomes from STEMI, and that's how fast we get into the lab when they have a confirmed STEMI, and whether we deliver what's called a care bundle, and that is around giving them analgesia and recording 2 pain scores. And stroke is about getting them into hospital within 60 minutes of the call, measuring their blood glucose and doing all the elements of a fast test. So it's not good enough to say they were fast positive because they were slowing their speech. You've got to tick all the boxes or you don't hit the target. Historically, we also used to measure our performance against asthma, single limb fracture, elderly fallers and mental health. But the wheels fell off the wagon a bit over the last year or so, and we're not currently measuring those. We are, however, now starting to measure the minimum data set, and we will be extending that to clinical performance indicators, measuring the sorts of things we need to know in terms of our staff doing what we feel they should be doing, judged against the national clinical guidelines. And the challenges we have are getting outcome data, because of course all of you have our outcome data, apart from the patients we leave in primary care, and the lag in reporting performance. So for these ACQIs, we report 3 months in arrears, which means that the data is not all that up to date. And that's the reason that when we present data to our trust board, and what you're looking at here is our ROSC data for the Utstein cases, and the blue line is SECAMB and the dotted line is national performance. So we're not doing too bad there, a bit of a dip here. But if you looked at our Red 1 performance in July, because this is reporting some months in arrears, you wouldn't be surprised. And that's a ROSC for all patients where we have hit a bit of a nadir. Our survival for the Utstein group of patients isn't too bad, and in fact is up at 40% for the month of August. It's quite small numbers, so small numbers makes a fairly big difference to your data. And this is cardiac arrest survival for all. So the national figure is around about, what's that, 10%. Ours was 10% last month, but the previous month was 4%, which is poor. And then STEMI outcome, I think this is probably around not documenting pain scores, because I would be surprised if you told me that patients were coming into your A&E departments not having had analgesia for STEMI. And I would be even more surprised if you told me that you were getting stroke patients where the crew didn't hand over a blood glucose when they appeared in your A&E department. The problem is that they don't record it on the PCR, then we don't get any marks for it, as it were. So we're having a bit of a push on why this is important to patients. Not about you must tick the boxes, but this is really important to patients, and we need you to reflect this, basically because we don't want to be bottom of the pack, because we get a beating from the commissioners on that. And of course we also look at the quality of care we deliver in other ways, and this is the quality dashboard that we have prepared for all our stations. So what you're looking at down here is all our sites, all our operating units. So we've got 10 operating units. We also have heart and EOC, and we look to see whether what their medicines management is like, what their hand hygiene is like, whether they're up to date on their infection prevention control training, whether they clean their vehicles, and we also look at their STEMI and stroke performance along here. We look at the number of incidents they've had and the number of SIs. So that is broken down by each OU, so that the managers and the team leaders can feed that back to their staff. Now, if you look at that dashboard, the predominant colour is red. So we've still got a bit of work to do, but at least we're measuring it. And if any of you are familiar with the mantra from Seattle about improving cardiac arrest survival, it's about measure and improve. So we are measuring and we hope to see improvement. So we all have challenges. I'm sure you've got horrendous challenges. These are some of ours. The CQC came to visit us in 2016, and we got a report which is probably the worst I've read. It didn't make easy reading. And I think the Trust probably spent the next 6 months fighting with the CQC to try and justify how it wasn't actually that bad. Whereas, quite honestly, with the CQC land you with a really awful report, you say, sorry guys, what do we need to do to fix it? Because if you say, that's a load of absolute cobblers, you just don't understand, they think you're being defensive and they get very, very cross. And the cross CQC doesn't help at all. So they came back in May this year and they found we had made some improvements, but they still felt we had a great deal to do. So we are still in special measures. You could say there are some advantages of being in special measures. You do get some extra dosh. There's about £500,000 going up to sometimes £1 million to support trusts in special measures. But essentially, if you're in special measures, they are saying you are so bad that you can't dig yourself out of this hole all on your own. You need additional support. And the things that they said we weren't doing well was that the quality of the service we provided was poor. They said we weren't safe because we weren't managing our medicines properly, that we weren't reporting risks, that we weren't replying to complaints in a reasonable time frame. They also felt that the culture in the organisation was poor and there was a culture of bullying and harassment. And we've been doing a huge amount of work on that to try and engage with staff and get them to read additional reports that we've had around the service to say, do you recognise this? And if so, what can we do about it? So trying to get engagement from the shop floor upwards to try and change the culture of the service. We're trying to look really hard at those cases where we have looked at disciplinary sanctions, and is it a clinical issue, and was this an honest mistake, or was it indeed a malicious act? Because people generally don't come to work to do a bad day's work, and if something goes really badly wrong, it's generally because there's been a system failure and not just an individual failure. We've had real challenges around recruitment and retention, so we closed down Banstead and moved our EOC into Crawley. We closed down Lewis and moved our EOC from Lewis into Crawley. Crawley has got employment at 105%. It's also got a number of call centres, so we've got quite a lot of competition. And then Sussex Police started recruiting, and they pay considerably more than we do. So that's one of the reasons our call handling was so poor. Now we are getting call handlers in through the door and our performance is getting better. Geographical difficulties. It's a hell of a long way to Thanet. I've mentioned EOC. It's been really difficult recruiting clinicians into our EOCs. If you have pathways, you have to have one clinician for every 6 EMAs, emergency medical dispatchers and attendants. Pipeline for paramedics, there's lots of competition for paramedics now. They can go and work as resus officers, they can work in EDs, minor injuries units. They are a very valued resource. And of course, retention of specialist paramedics has been shockingly poor. Not so much for the CCPs, for the paramedic practitioners, as I mentioned. And I've also mentioned that our estate varies from the very poor to the rather better. I mean, Crawley is a nice environment if you like working in an open plan office. So, demand's going up year on year, as it is across the health service. Particularly in SECAMB, we have an elderly population. So if you look at the coastal towns in SECAMB, they've got a very elderly and ageing population with lots of comorbidities, and it's a population which often doesn't have much support from families. So if you work in the East End of London with a predominantly Asian and Bengali population, you won't find old people not being looked after by their families. But if you work with English and UK born and bred families, you will find that they do have relatives, but they're all a long way away, at least 3 streets away, but I never see them. So we are not good at looking after our old folks. So, system changes. You'll be aware that we have 4 sustainability and transformation footprints in our area. It's quite difficult for ambulance services to be a big player in that because we're quite small, and it's also quite difficult to field the personnel to impact on what they're doing. But they can think of all sorts of really interesting plans, but unless they involve us, it's not going to work. So if they're going to relocate services, we really need to be involved. A good example of that is what happened at Kent and Canterbury, where in July there was the GMC decided to move junior doctors because there were inadequate training facilities, and so it essentially lost its ED. So there's a fucking great hole in the middle of Kent, and that means that you need additional ambulance resources to take patients to the next nearest hospitals, which are a significant number of miles away. I find this really strange, having spent my professional life in London, where as a paramedic in South West Ambulance Service told me on one occasion when I was trying to get an ambulance for somebody who'd been involved in an RTC, it's not like this down here. We don't have an emergency department on every street corner and an ambulance station every 3 miles. I think, to be fair, the contribution of the ambulance service is not really well understood until it all goes bent, until hospitals decide that they can't manage ENT emergencies over a weekend and that they're all going to be transferred. When actually, any ED worth its salt will manage the vast majority of ENT emergencies, and you don't need to send them anywhere. System pressures. So service delivery is changing, and we can't always control it. So things like stroke reconfiguration, we can put in our Tuppence halfpenny worth, but we will essentially be presented with what the system feels is the best configuration, and we will have to work with it. And what we then need to do is to make sure we're adequately funded to have the vehicles to provide the right resources. I think the other thing is with ARP, the Ambulance Response Programme, you need to change the configuration of your fleet. Now, SECAMB had more cars, more fast response cars than any other ambulance service in the country. They had about 250 SRVs. You look at West Midlands Ambulance Service, which serves a population about the same size and with some of the same rurality as ours. They, on New Year's Eve, they put out, their busiest night of the year, they put out 10 cars. So we are having to massively transform our fleet. Now, when you see those nice big yellow trucks bombing down narrow country roads, and you think, I wonder why they went for something that big and that heavy on those narrow roads, it actually takes quite a long time to get those vehicles out and up and running. And we are looking at whether it would be better to have a smaller van conversion, which might be easier and quicker to use. But it does take time, and we're not. You might think that if all the ambulance services pooled their resources, we'd be a big player in this. We're not. Look at Ocado and Tesco, and the number of those trucks you see. You see 10 of those for every ambulance. So we're not a big player when it comes to purchasing ambulances. And then, of course, there's capacity in the other parts of the system. GP out of hours being a particularly good example. So primary care fell over at Christmas. There was no out-of-hours care in East Kent on Christmas Day or Boxing Day. And PTS, so we gave up the PTS contract some years ago. But if you look critically at the PTS contracts that you have in your hospitals, do they actually serve the demands that you have when it comes to moving patients around the system? Because historically, you've used us. But we shouldn't be doing routine transfers. We'll do stuff that needs an escalation of care, but A, you need to provide the resources to go with those patients, and B, we don't do your PTS transfers. We've got enough work in the community. And that is shown very dramatically by delays at hospital and how they have escalated. So what you're looking at here is back in 2013-14, things weren't too bad. The number of hours lost at hospital wasn't too bad, sort of bumbled along at about 500 lost hours a year. And then it all started going in the wrong direction. And you can see that last year, the black line, and this year, the blue line, things aren't great. And when you get into what is winter, you could argue that winter is all year round in this country. And it's amazing because, you know, Christmas comes every year, and yet it seems to be a surprise. So we've seen an increase of 18% in the Christmas period. So between Christmas Eve and after New Year, we lost over 3,000 operational hours with our vehicles sitting outside your A&E departments. And that equates to an additional 13 ambulances. So when you see crews hopping from one foot to another, it's because they are desperate to get out and pick the next patient up off the floor, or not, as the case may be. But that's the pressure on the system that we have. And yes, we are looking at this pretty critically. So we are able to look at your individual performance and see how you rate and where our vehicles are sitting a lot of the time. So what have we got here? We've got the Royal Sussex, which is in deep purple. That sounds quite an appropriate colour. And we've got Epsom. Epsom's not too bad. We've got East Surrey, Afternoon Julian.
Afternoon, Julian.
And we've got one of my favourites from London, Down Valley. So we are really working with the hospitals because there's absolutely no point our jumping out of our tree and saying it is completely inappropriate that our vehicles are tied up. This is a system problem. I think we've got to get beyond the you're bringing us too many patients and the hospital saying you're admitting too many patients. The patients are there, the workload is there. Anecdotally, we're hearing that you've had a lot more sick patients self-presenting this winter. Whether that is because we've gone over to ARP and we are telling the lower priority patients that an ambulance will not be with them for about 2 hours, and many of them are saying, well, blow that for a game of soldiers, I'll make my own way. But it does mean that we're managing expectations a lot more proactively than we did before. But we are working closely with the hospitals and the system to try and manage this, because it's not to anybody's advantage for there to be stand-up rows between our team leaders and your senior nurses and bed managers. It doesn't get any of us, it doesn't get us anywhere, and the patients, it's the patients that suffer. So, where are we going? Well, essentially our strategy is to be better today and even better tomorrow. But essentially it is to try and get the wheels back on the vehicle this year, to consolidate it next year, and really start moving forward in years 3 to 5 with a more innovative and higher quality service. And it's to build with our commissioners a sustainable, high quality service going forward. Other opportunities, I mentioned the mix of vehicles and staff. We need more DCAs, double crewed ambulances, and fewer cars. We need to look at what the right mix of staff is. Do we just need ECSWs to go and pick people up and take them to the hospital, or are we going to continue down the route that SECAMB has historically, which is to have decision makers who can potentially leave more patients in the community? That's fine, provided we're doing it safely and they've got the right sort of support. And part of that for me is building up a clinical hub within the control centres, so you can phone a friend and talk the decisions through. Improving our infrastructure, we've done a lot of that. We've replaced our CAD. It was the most unreliable CAD in the country. We've now got a new CAD in and it's working really well, and the reason you don't know that is because it came in without any problems. If it had gone down, you would have known about it, because when your CAD goes down, and believe me, I have lived through 2 CAD failures, 2 complete CAD failures when new CADs came in and patients died. I will remain scarred by it for the rest of my days. And investing in vehicles, we've got 80 new vehicles on order. We've got some of the oldest vehicles in England, 250,000 miles, round the clock a couple of times, 200 not very careful drivers. Quality of our services, we got an absolute caning from the CQC on medicines management, and I think I have probably spent about 70% of my time since I joined the Trust on medicines management. It's been a real journey in terms of making sure that our medicines are kept safe and secure, and it's about making sure that things like PGDs are up to date. And we've had a huge amount of help on the CCP PGDs with colleagues in the audience. But it's all quite time consuming. It's in a much, much better place now, but you just need to keep the focus on it. I've mentioned trying to drive up quality, and that's quality of patient care, as well as the quality of life for our staff. We've made huge strides in ensuring that they get off on time and we don't have too many shift overruns, because if you work a 12-hour shift and you then have an overrun of an hour and a half and you've got an hour to get home, you're probably not safe driving home. You're probably all aware of a junior doctor who has died as a result of falling asleep at the wheel after a night shift. Investing in our staff, we've introduced the operational team leader role. That is essentially supernumerary. So we have 150 operational team leaders who should be making sure that all their staff are up to date with their training and that they do their CPIs and all the rest of it. A lot of them are spending quite a lot of time working with you in the emergency departments at the moment. We're trying to engage with our staff and ensure that we have a really healthy culture in the organisation, so people feel it's a safe environment to talk about when things went wrong, because mistakes happen. You know, if you haven't made a mistake, you haven't seen enough patients. But paramedics are a very risk-averse bunch, and they are very, very frightened about their registration. And historically, we've been a bit too ready to ask them to report themselves to the Health Professions Council. Paramedics in general are reported to their governing body more frequently than any other healthcare professional. And SECAMB has reported more staff than, or has had more staff self-report. So there is a bit of a culture of fear, and we've got to get over that. And the STPs are also a challenge, but potentially as a challenge comes an opportunity. So if I can get this to work, there's a video here, but it just shows how wonderful our staff are in dealing with patients.
It's just how calm they all were. From the minute they got out the ambulance, they knew what they were doing.
They saved my life. There's no two ways about it. Without them, I'd be dead. And Emily would never have met her father. Hugo wouldn't have a father. The fact they kind of do this day in, day out as their job is totally mind-blowing, really.
Without their dedication, I would not be here today. There's no two ways about it. I just can't thank them enough.
I think they're guardian angels. In our case, they were lifesavers, literally. So they deserve all the credit they get. So they really are amazing.
I would have to say a huge thank you to them for the way they handled the situation and helped my family, not just me.
We owe them everything, because, you know, we would have lost a member of our family, and I don't want to lose him.
You know, I'm so glad that, like, you know, we've got these guys who actually works for the NHS.
So it means a huge amount that our staff treat patients with dignity and with respect. We just need to make sure that the clinical care is of the same really high order. The one thing the CQC found when they came to visit us was that the caring attitude of our staff was excellent. That's been a recurrent theme in ambulance services. So ambulance staff are generally really nice to patients. And happy to take questions, but my sort of signature are these guys here. They're the people who keep me sane. I was going to say perhaps my kids keep me sane, but I'm not sure about that. These are the 18th most popular dog in the country. Have you watched the programme earlier in the week? I think that must have been an absolutely flawed survey. I can't imagine anybody would think that a Labrador, which can eat its body weight in food, in any way compares to this pair, who are excellent. But happy to take any questions.